You know, when you think about a sprawling cross-country highway, I feel like you automatically picture, like, the concrete being poured.
Right, yeah. You picture the construction crews.
Exactly. You picture someone with a hard hat, a clipboard, and, a master plan.
Like a government or an empire deciding things.
Yeah, deciding, we are going to build a road right here from point A to point B.
Right, because it is highly intentional. It's engineered from the top down,
Yeah.
usually to serve, the strategic or economic interests of whoever happens to be paying for all that concrete.
And that is usually exactly how we picture the great trade routes of history, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We imagine like a Roman emperor or a Chinese dynasty pointing at a map and saying, let's build a route to trade our silk and spices.
Right, drawing lines on a map.
Yeah, we tend to think of history as this series of rigid lines drawn by the people in charge. But today, well, we are taking a sledgehammer to that assumption.
We really are.
We have this staggering stack of historical texts and archaeological research in front of us for today's deep dive, and it's detailing the true history of what is widely known as the Maritime Silk Road.
And it's a completely different story than what most people think.
It really is. The foundational premise of our deep dive today for you, the listener, is that almost everything you think you know about ancient global trade is likely wrong.
Completely wrong.
It is. It's completely land-biased, Eurocentric, and Sinocentric. The real engine of ancient globalization was not like camel caravans traversing dusty deserts.
Not even close. When you actually look at the historical record, particularly when you look at the ocean, that top-down master plan completely vanishes.
It just doesn't exist.
Right. You are no longer looking at a highway built by a state. You are looking at a wild, untamed web of connections built by, well, forgotten prehistoric sailors.
Sailors who didn't exactly leave behind a map.
Exactly. They didn't leave a map, let alone a written language to, boast about their achievements.
So today, we are going to trace the entire narrative arc of this phenomenon, right?
Yeah, starting from its really surprising origins in prehistoric maritime networks, which was thousands of years before the Roman Empire even existed, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah, and we'll follow it all the way through its unprecedented expansion during the medieval economic boom.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think we need to start by completely dismantling the name itself.
The name is a huge problem.
Right. The Maritime Silk Road, it sounds very official, it sounds ancient, but it's actually just a modern branding exercise, isn't it?
It is entirely a modern invention. We really have to deconstruct that term before we can even understand the reality of what happened.
So where did it come from?
Well, the Overland Silk Road, the one everyone pictures with the camels and the desert caravans, that name was actually invented in 1877.
Wait, 1877?
Yeah.
So, nobody traveling on the actual ancient overland route ever called it the Silk Road?
Never. Not once. It was coined by a Prussian geographer named Baron von Richthofen.
A Prussian geographer in the 19th century?
Exactly. Von Richthofen was doing a geological survey of China in the late 19th century. He was specifically trying to figure out how to connect China to Germany with, a sprawling network of railways.
Okay, so it was about trains.
Right. He coined the term Seidenstrasse, or Silk Road, basically as an academic label for his maps.
That is wild.
And the term didn't even enter the popular English lexicon until 1938, when a Swedish explorer named Sven Hedin published a popular book using the phrase.
So the Maritime Silk Road is literally just a spin-off of a 19th century railway marketing term?
Basically, yes. For the vast majority of its history, this ancient oceanic route spanning the Indo-West Pacific had no name whatsoever. It was just life.
That is fascinating. We constantly project this modern branded packaging backward onto the past to make it easier to digest.
We do it all the time.
So if it wasn't the Chinese or the Romans building this route for silk, who were the true pioneers? Who actually started moving goods across the open ocean?
The true pioneers were the Austronesians.
The Austronesians.
Okay. Yeah, these are the indigenous peoples originally hailing from Taiwan and the northern Philippines.
And when are we talking?
Long before the 2nd century BCE. They were out there on the open water, establishing these really complex precursor networks that would eventually evolve into the global shipping lanes we know today.
And what exactly were they trading? Because, if it wasn't silk, what resource was valuable enough to justify risking your life on the open ocean in a prehistoric wooden boat?
Jade.
Jade.
Specifically, a vibrant and incredibly widespread trade in Vengtian jade. This ran roughly from 2000 BCE all the way to 1000 CE.
Wow, so a 3,000-year run.
Exactly. We are talking about an expansive 3,000-kilometer trade area centered entirely around the South China Sea.
And where did the jade come from?
Raw nephrite jade was being sourced from geological deposits in eastern Taiwan, but it wasn't just being used locally.
Right, they were shipping it out.
Yes, it was being exported in raw form and then worked into highly specific, complex ornaments down in the Philippines.
I am looking at the pictures of these artifacts in our source notes right now. They are called the Ling Ling O.
Yes, the Ling Ling O. These are predominantly double-headed pendants and penannular earrings.
Penannular.
It just means it is a continuous ring with a small, deliberate break or slit in it, like a little opening.
Oh, okay, I see it.
They are incredibly distinctive in their geometry. And what is vital here is that we find these exact same jade artifacts, chemically verified to be made from Taiwanese jade, but crafted in the Philippines, spread across an enormous geographic area.
Like where?
Archaeologists have uncovered them in southern Vietnam, linked to what is known as the Sa Huyn culture. They are found in Borneo, eastern peninsular Malaysia, eastern Cambodia, and peninsular Thailand.
That is a massive area.
It is. This entire sprawling region is known to archaeologists as the Sa Huyn Kalanay interaction sphere.
Okay, we need to unpack that jargon for a second. The Sahun-Kalanay interaction sphere.
It's a mouthful, I know.
Yeah. What does that actually mean in practice? Let me try to visualize this.
Yeah.
You have raw, incredibly hard stone being mined on an island in Taiwan.
Right.
It gets loaded onto a wooden boat, sailed across hundreds of miles of open ocean to the Philippines.
Yep.
There, local artisans spend countless hours carving it. And keep in mind, they don't have metal tools. How do you even carve nephrite jade without steel?
You use immense patience and friction.
Just friction.
Basically, they use bamboo drills, quartz sand, and water. You place the abrasive quartz sand on the jade, and you use the bamboo like a rotary tool, letting the sand do the cutting.
Oh my God.
It would take weeks, sometimes months of continuous labor just to hollow out a single earring.
Unbelievable. So they spend months grinding this stone into these beautiful, intricate ling-ling earrings. Then those finished earrings are put on another boat and sailed over 1,000 miles to Vietnam, to Thailand, to Malaysia.
Exactly.
And this wasn't just like a brief fad. You said this went on for 3,000 years.
3 millennia. And your question about the interaction sphere is the key to all of this. They weren't just trading pretty green rocks for the sake of having pretty green rocks.
Right. There had to be a deeper meaning.
There was. The Ling Ling O represents a deeply shared material culture. I mean, if you are a village leader in Vietnam wearing the exact same highly specific ceremonial jewelry as someone living 1,000 miles across the ocean in the Philippines, it means you share a fundamental belief system.
You share aesthetics.
Yes, you share cultural values and symbols of status. It indicates profound, sustained, societal interconnectedness. And it wasn't just the jade either. We also see the widespread distribution of enormous ceremonial bronze instruments known as dong sun drums.
Right. The notes mention these drums. They originated in northern Vietnam, right? Between 600 BCE and 400 CE.
Correct. And these things are colossal. Some weigh hundreds of pounds.
Wow.
They're intricately cast bronze drums featuring star motifs and depictions of feathered warriors.
Yeah.
Yet we find these incredibly heavy, fragile instruments transported all throughout island Southeast Asia.
That sounds like a nightmare to move.
Imagine the logistical complexity of loading a 200-pound, priceless bronze drum onto a prehistoric boat and keeping it safe across 1,000 miles of turbulent ocean.
It is mind-boggling. It feels like a prehistoric oceanic internet.
That's a great way to put it.
Moving information, moving culture, moving incredibly heavy physical goods, but entirely without a central server.
Right. No central authority at all.
There is no capital city controlling it all, no emperor demanding tribute. They didn't even have a written language to record the transactions.
Nope. None of that.
But hold on, I am struggling with the mechanics of this. How on earth were they crossing the South China Sea out of sight of land thousands of years before the invention of the magnetic compass or the astrolabe?
It's a great question.
I mean, how do you not just get endlessly lost and die of thirst?
That is the pivotal question, really. And the answer is that the Austronesians developed a sophisticated system of environmental navigation that didn't require metal instruments at all. They didn't need a magnetic compass because they used a star compass.
Explain how a star compass works, because I look at the night sky and just see, like, a chaotic scatter of lights.
Well, it relies on absolute generational memorization of the night sky. A star compass isn't a physical object you hold in your hand, right? It is a mental construct.
Oh, entirely mental.
Entirely. Navigators memorized the exact rising and setting points of dozens of specific stars on the horizon. Because stars rise and set at the same fixed points on the horizon year-round, even if the time of night changes, you can use them as fixed compass points.
Oh, I see.
They paid special attention to zenith stars. Those are stars that pass directly overhead at a specific latitude.
Okay, so how does that help you steer a boat?
If you know the zenith star of your home island, you just sail north or south until that star passes directly over your mast. And then you turn east or west and just ride that latitude line all the way home.
That requires an encyclopedic memory. But what happens during the day? Or, when it's cloudy and you can't see the stars?
That is when you read the ocean itself. Austronesian and Polynesian navigators were masters of reading wave refraction.
Wave refraction.
Yeah. Deep ocean swells move in straight lines, driven by distant weather systems. But when a swell hits an island, even an island that is beyond the horizon, completely out of sight, that straight swell bends around the landmass.
It bends.
It refracts and it reflects back. An expert navigator could sit in the hull of a wooden canoe, feel the subtle cross-chop of a refracted wave hitting the main swell, and point exactly to where an unseen island was located, miles away.
So they're literally feeling the invisible geography of the ocean through the wood of their boats.
Precisely. They also created teaching tools for this.
Really? Like maps?
Sorta. While they didn't have written language, they created what we call stick charts. They would take ribs of palm fronds and tie them together into intricate grids. Small cowrie shells were tied to the intersections to represent islands.
Oh, that's clever.
And the curved sticks represented the predominant ocean swell patterns and how they bent around the islands. It was a physical, tactile map of ocean fluid dynamics. Combine that with observing the flight paths of specific seabirds like terns and noddies, which, they fly out to fish in the morning and return to land at dusk. And you have a really robust, multifaceted navigational system.
Okay, so the navigation is brilliant, but let's talk about the physical boats. Because knowing where to go doesn't matter if your boat shatters under a rogue wave.
Very true.
How are they building these vessels without iron nails?
They utilized a completely unique, highly advanced construction method known as sewn plank and lash lug architecture. And honestly, the lack of iron was actually their greatest advantage.
I'm going to need you to break down lash lug because I am having trouble visualizing it.
Sure. Imagine you were carving a thick wooden plank to form the hull of a ship. Instead of carving the plank perfectly flat on both sides, the Austronesian shipbuilders would carve the outside smooth, but on the inside surface, they would deliberately leave small, protruding rectangular blocks of wood. Those blocks are the lugs.
Okay, so the inside of the plank looks like it has little wooden speed bumps running along it.
Exactly. Then they would drill holes horizontally through those protruding wooden lugs. They didn't use metal to hold the ship together. They used cords made from incredibly strong plant materials.
Like ropes.
Yeah, specifically sugar palm fiber. They would pass these fibers through the holes in the lugs to lash the planks tightly to the internal wooden ribs of the ship.
And the sewn plank part.
The sewn plank aspect means the planks themselves were also stitched edge to edge using the same fiber ropes. Crucially, they engineered it so the stitches were only visible from the inside of the hull.
Why only on the inside?
It protected the vital ropes from the corrosive seawater and the scraping of coral reefs on the outside.
But why go through all that trouble? I mean, why not just use rigid wooden pegs or figure out how to forge iron nails? It seems so tedious.
Because the open ocean is a dynamic, violently shifting environment. If you build a highly rigid ship with iron nails, what happens when a colossal wave slams into the side of it?
I assume the force transfers straight through the rigid structure. Something has to give, so the wood splinters or the nails rust, bend, and eventually pop out.
Precisely. But a lashed lug, sewn plank ship, it is inherently flexible. It gives.
And it bends with the waves.
Yes. When a rogue wave hits it, those sugar palm fiber lashings stretch slightly. They absorb the kinetic energy. The entire hull literally flexes and breathes with the motion of the ocean. It was an ingenious biomechanical adaptation to deep-sea voyaging.
That is incredible.
Furthermore, they stabilized these narrow, flexible hulls using outriggers, those long, parallel floats attached to the side of the main hull by wooden booms. The outriggers prevented the ships from capsizing in strong crosswinds.
Which brings us to the sails. The notes mention something called a crab claw sail.
Yes, the crab claw sail. What's fascinating here is that it's an absolute marvel of ancient aerodynamics.
How so?
Well, unlike the square sails used by the ancient Romans or Egyptians, which basically just act like parachutes catching the wind from behind, the Austronesian crab claw sail acts like an airfoil.
Like an airplane wing.
Exactly. It is shaped like a triangle with curved edges. Modern wind tunnel tests have actually shown that the unique shape of the crab claw sail generates a vortex of rotating air along its top edge.
Really?
Yeah, it's very similar to the lift generated by the delta wings on modern supersonic fighter jets. This vortex lift allowed Austronesian ships to sail significantly closer to the wind, meaning they could sail at an angle almost directly into oncoming wind, far better than European ships could for centuries.
That is astounding. You have flexible, shock-absorbing hulls, stabilized by outriggers, driven by vortex-generating sails, and guided by navigators who can read the reflection of waves and the paths of stars.
It's a pretty unbeatable combination.
And armed with this technology, they didn't just stay put in the South China Sea. They aimed those crab claw sails west.
Far west. Between 1500 and 600 BCE, these Southeast Asian sailors used their advanced ships to establish lucrative spice trade networks straight across the Indian Ocean,
Reaching where?
reaching the shores of Sri Lanka and southern India.
1500 BCE. Let's just put that in perspective for a second. We are talking roughly around the time the new kingdom of Egypt is just being founded.
Right.
This is long before the classical Greek era of Athens and Sparta, and Southeast Asians are already making regular transoceanic cargo runs to India. What exactly are they bringing with them?
They were bringing an entire transformative biological and cultural package.
Yeah.
This is the era where we see the introduction of vital Austronesian crops to South Asia.
Like what kinds of crops?
They brought coconuts, sandalwood, sugarcane, and highly coveted spices like cloves and nutmeg, which at that time only grew on a few specific tiny islands in eastern Indonesia.
Oh, wow.
Crucially, they also introduced the domesticated banana to the Indian subcontinent, and they brought their daily habits too.
Like cultural habits.
Yeah, the practice of chewing betel nut, which is a mild stimulant that is still ubiquitous across many parts of Asia today, that was a direct Austronesian introduction.
That's amazing.
You can even see their technological footprint today. Traditional fishermen in Sri Lanka and southern India still use variations of the Austronesian outrigger boat design.
But trade is never a one-way street, right? I can't imagine the merchants in India were just accepting these incredible goods and offering nothing in return.
You are absolutely right. The exchange was deeply reciprocal. South Asia sent back their own domesticated crops, including mung beans and horse gram, which permanently altered the Southeast Asian diet.
Oh, interesting.
They also exported highly manufactured, high-value goods. Archaeologists have excavated early Thai coastal sites, like Khao Sam Keo, which dates from 400 to 100 BCE, and found thousands of semi-precious stone and glass ornaments.
Were those made locally?
No, they feature distinct northern Indian manufacturing techniques. And what is the smoking gun connecting it all? These same Thai archaeological sites also contain goods from the prehistoric Austronesian jade network we discussed earlier.
Oh, so it's all overlapping.
Exactly. So the physical evidence gives us an undeniable picture. The eastern maritime routes of the Austronesians had physically and economically linked up with South Asia.
But they didn't stop at India. The source material highlights a connection that completely blew my mind. They kept sailing west, straight across the entire Indian Ocean, all the way to Africa.
Yes. This remains one of the most astonishing, underreported feats of human migration and endurance in ancient history.
Really? Africa?
Yes. There is incontrovertible genetic, linguistic, and botanical evidence of Austronesian contact with Africa. Sometime between the 1st century and the 7th century CE, Austronesian explorers actually colonized the massive island of Madagascar, which sits just off the southeastern coast of the African continent.
Wait, so you're telling me that the presence of... Wait, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. You were telling me that the ancestors of the people living in Madagascar today came from Southeast Asia.
Yes.
That is a journey of over 4,000 miles across the open Indian Ocean.
That is exactly what the evidence proves. If you study the Malagasy language spoken in Madagascar today, it does not belong to the African language families.
It doesn't.
No, it belongs to the Austronesian language family. Linguists have traced its closest linguistic relative to languages spoken in southern Borneo, deep in Indonesia. Furthermore, modern genetic studies of the Malagasy people show a profound, almost equal mixture of Austronesian and African ancestry.
And just like with India, they didn't just bring themselves, right? They brought their farms with them.
Precisely. They brought their entire agricultural toolkit across the ocean. If you look at the crops that became foundational staple foods in parts of Africa during the first millennium BCE, Things like bananas, taro, the purple yam, and certain types of domestic chickens, those are all originally Austronesian domesticates.
Bananas in Africa came from Indonesia.
Yes, they trace their lineage directly back to these prehistoric Southeast Asian sailors.
I know that the listener might be skeptical here, so let's dig into the science. How do we know a chicken in Africa came from Indonesia rather than just, evolving locally?
Through the tracking of mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA.
Okay, DNA tracking.
Right. Mitochondrial DNA is distinct from nuclear DNA. It is passed down almost exclusively from the mother to her offspring. Because it doesn't mix with the father's DNA, it remains relatively stable over generations, only changing through natural, predictable mutation rates.
There's like a molecular clock.
Exactly. It acts as a molecular clock. When geneticists sequence the mitochondrial DNA of specific chicken populations in Madagascar and along the East African coast, they find specific genetic markers, haplogroups, that point undeniably to an East Asian origin. The genes of those chickens literally map the trade wines back to Indonesia.
Wait, so you're telling me the presence of the banana in Africa, a staple crop that provided the caloric density to support the growth of massive populations on the continent, is a direct causal result of prehistoric Southeast Asian sailors crossing the Indian Ocean in sewn-together wooden boats?
Yes, it fundamentally upends the standard historical narrative we're taught in school.
It really does.
And it is important to note that while the Austronesians were conquering the vast distances of the East, there was a parallel maritime network developing in West Asia. Since the Neolithic Ubaid period, roughly around 5000 BCE, distinct coastal trading cultures were emerging.
The Ubaid period. That is ancient Mesopotamia, right? Predating the Sumerians.
Exactly.
No.
The Ubaid people lived in the marshlands of what is now southern Iraq. They were building boats out of bundled reeds, waterproofing them with naturally occurring bitumen, basically liquid asphalt, and hugging the coastlines to trade.
Oh, that's smart.
Over millennia, these short-range coastal routes expanded, eventually linking Sri Lanka, the Malabar coast of India, Persia, Mesopotamia, and eventually stretching up into the Red Sea toward Egypt and the Mediterranean. By the first millennium BCE, this western circuit was a bustling, regular trade highway between ancient urban centers.
So the board is set. You have the Austronesian network dominating the east, utilizing deep ocean navigation and outriggers, pushing deep into the Indian Ocean. And you have the West Asian network utilizing different shipbuilding techniques, hugging the coasts from the Mediterranean down to India. What happens when these two immense spheres of human exchange finally collide?
By approximately the 2nd century BCE, these prehistoric Austronesian jade and spice networks fully and permanently merged with the South Asian, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean routes.
They linked up.
The global circuit was complete. You now had a continuous, uninterrupted chain of maritime exchange flowing from the East China Sea all the way to the Red Sea and the coast of East Africa. This convergence marks the true birth of what we now casually call the Maritime Silk Road.
If you have a global network this lucrative, someone is going to figure out how to exploit it. Who is getting rich off this continuous chain?
In the early centuries, the eastern half of the route was still primarily sailed by Southeast Asian Austronesian traders in their lash lug ships, while Persian, Arab, and Tamil traders largely sailed the western half.
Makes sense.
But as the sheer volume of luxury goods swelled, it inevitably led to the rise of specialized sea empires in Southeast Asia. Historians call these thalassocracies.
Thalassocracy. From the Greek thalassa meaning sea and kritos meaning power. A sea empire. I love that term.
It is the perfect description. And the absolute apex predator of these early thalassocracies was the Srivijaya Empire.
Srivijaya.
Srivijaya was founded around 682 CE, and its capital was centered in Palembang on the island of Sumatra. Srivijaya is fascinating because they did not derive their power from controlling massive tracts of agricultural land or fielding massive land armies like the Roman or Han empires.
How did they get their power then?
They derived their staggering wealth and power through the absolute exploitation of geography. They controlled the choke points.
Let's visualize the map for a second. If you are a merchant ship sailing from the Indian Ocean, trying to get to the lucrative markets of the South China Sea, you physically cannot sail in a straight line, right?
Right, impossible.
The massive land masses of Malaysia and Indonesia are in your way. You basically have to squeeze your ship through one of two incredibly narrow waterways, the Strait of Malacca or the Sunda Strait.
Exactly. And Srivijaya established their capital right near the Strait of Malacca.
I like to think of Srivijaya as a medieval bouncer standing at the only door to the most exclusive, wealthy club in the world. But it's even more restrictive than a toll booth. Because of the weather, they didn't just tax you, they trapped you.
Yes, the monsoon winds. This is the crucial mechanism that defined the entire rhythm of the Maritime Silk Road. The word monsoon actually comes from the Arabic word masim, meaning season.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, the winds don't just blow randomly. Due to the thermodynamic differences between the massive Asian landmass heating up and the ocean cooling down, the winds reverse direction entirely twice a year.
Really?
Yeah.
Entirely?
Entirely. In the winter, the winds blow steadily from the northeast, pushing ships down from China and India toward Indonesia. But in the summer, the winds flip, blowing from the southwest, pushing ships back up toward the north.
So if you are a Persian merchant arriving at Srivijaya's door in December, you can't just pay a tax, sail through, do your business in China, and sail right back. The wind is literally blowing against you.
Yep, you're stuck.
You are geographically trapped in Srivijaya for 6 months, waiting for the summer monsoon to blow you home.
Exactly. Srivijaya understood this perfectly. They didn't just build a toll booth, they built a captive hospitality industry.
That is brilliant.
They provided the warehouses, the lodging, the entertainment, and the marketplaces for thousands of foreign merchants trapped by the winds. Srivijaya violently subjugated their neighboring rival thalassocracies, places like Malayu, Kedah, and Tarumanagara, to ensure a total monopoly.
They own the whole block.
They did. They controlled the flow of highly prized luxury aromatics, like frankincense and myrrh from West Asia, and funneled them straight into the incredibly wealthy market of the Tang dynasty in China. They skimmed profits off of every single transaction that occurred during those 6-month layovers.
But when you have thousands of foreign merchants trapped in a city together for 6 months at a time, year after year, they aren't just trading spices, they are intermarrying. They are sharing meals. And most importantly, they are sharing beliefs. This network was moving gods as efficiently as it moved camphor.
That is one of the most profound legacies of the route. The Maritime Silk Road was the primary arterial vehicle for the eastward spread of both Hinduism and Buddhism from the Indian subcontinent.
Really? Not overland?
Mainly by sea. The connection between the merchant classes and these religious systems was so deep that by the 4th century CE, Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hinduism, had actually become the primary trade lingua franca of the route. It was the common language of business.
So picture this. You are a local Indonesian merchant trying to negotiate the price of nutmeg with a trader who just arrived from Vietnam. To understand each other, you are both haggling in Sanskrit.
That was the reality of the Asian Mediterranean. We have incredibly detailed written records confirming this atmosphere, primarily from Chinese monks like Wan Shen in the 3rd century and later Huilin.
What were Chinese monks doing on these ships?
These Buddhist scholars were desperate to travel to India to study original Buddhist texts at the source. But China didn't have ocean-going ships capable of the journey yet.
Right.
So their journals detail how they booked passage on the massive Southeast Asian trading vessels, which the Chinese texts refer to as the Kunlun Po.
What do the monks' journals actually say about these ships?
Wan Chen's accounts are filled with absolute awe. He writes about boarding these staggering Austronesian ships, noting that a single vessel could carry up to 700 people and over 260 tons of cargo.
700 people. That's a cruise ship.
It is. He marvels at their multiple masts and sails, specifically describing how the sails were arranged obliquely to catch the wind from different angles, a clear description of the crab claw or tanja sail arrangements. For centuries, the Chinese relied entirely on these foreign vessels for deep water transport.
And as the centuries roll on, the religious landscape shifts again. A new major faith enters the global chat.
Yes. By the 7th century CE, Arab merchants utilizing swift, lateen-rigged ships, called dhows, began venturing deeper into the eastern routes, following paths pioneered earlier by Persian traders.
This coincides with the rise of Islam, right?
Exactly. This coincided directly with the explosive, rapid spread of Islam throughout West Asia and the Arabian Peninsula. These Arab traders pushed east, establishing permanent expatriate communities in Srivijaya and even as far as Guangzhou in southern China. Just as waiting out the monsoons facilitated the spread of Buddhism earlier, it now facilitated the introduction of Islam into Southeast Asian polities. And reflecting this cultural shift, the Persian language, Farsi, eventually replaced Sanskrit as the dominant lingua franca across both the maritime and overland Silk Roads.
It is incredible to imagine the sheer cosmopolitan density of these ancient port cities. You would walk through the markets of Srivijaya or Guangzhou and see Austronesian sailors, Tamil merchants from southern India, Arab dhow captains, Persian traders, and Chinese monks all rubbing elbows, sharing food, exchanging
It
ideas.
was a true melting pot.
But this raises a major tension point in the narrative. For hundreds of years, China, the most populous and wealthy empire in the region, is basically just the final destination point. They aren't controlling the shipping. When does the massive land power to the north decide it wants to become a maritime superpower?
That transition occurs due to massive geopolitical trauma between the 10th and 13th centuries. Specifically, it centers on the rise of the Song dynasty.
What happened?
To understand the shift, you have to understand the traditional Chinese Confucian mindset. Confucianism held a deep systemic disdain for private merchants and foreign trade. They viewed agriculture as the noble, foundational pursuit of society, and viewed merchants as parasitic millmen who profited off the labor of others without creating anything tangible.
So they look down on the sea traders.
Exactly. Furthermore, China's imperial focus had always been aimed westward, toward the overland Silk Road.
But the map changes. The Song dynasty loses the north.
Exactly. Invading nomadic groups, primarily the Khitan and later the Jurchen, conquered the northern territories of China. The Song dynasty was forced to retreat south.
Oh, wow.
In doing so, they lost total access to the overland Silk Road. They were completely cut off from their traditional lucrative westward trade routes. Out of sheer economic necessity, the Song court had to look to the ocean.
They didn't have a choice.
Right. They systematically loosened the rigid Confucian restrictions on private maritime trade. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this desperate pivot kicks off an unprecedented medieval economic boom.
But wait, you just said that Chinese monks were booking passage on Southeast Asian ships because Chinese ships were strictly river-bound? How do you go from river barges to dominating the deep ocean in a few generations?
Through an aggressive, state-sponsored program of observation and technological transfer, before the Song dynasty, Chinese ships were primarily fluvial, meaning they were designed for the calm, shallow waters of rivers. They were completely unseaworthy in open ocean swells.
So they just sank if they went out too far.
Pretty much. But Chinese shipwrights in the southern coastal cities began intensely observing the massive Austronesian and Arab vessels docking in their ports. They absorbed those foreign concepts and engineered their own entirely unique style of ocean-going ship, which became known as the chuan, or the junk.
So how did a Chinese Tuan differ from the flexible lash-lug ships of the Austronesians?
It was born from a completely divergent engineering philosophy. Where the Austronesians prized flexibility and used fiber lashings, the Chinese chuan favored rigid strength.
Rigid, like iron nails.
Yes, they utilized flat-bottomed hulls without a deep keel. Instead of fiber, the Chinese shipwrights used heavy iron nails and metal clamps to force the massive wooden planks together. Instead of two side-mounted steering oars, the Chinese implemented a single, massive, centralized rudder mounted directly to the stern of the ship, allowing for precise steering.
That makes sense.
But their most brilliant, world-changing innovation was the internal division of the hull into watertight compartments using solid wooden bulkheads.
Let me bring in a modern analogy here. That is exactly how modern military submarines and cruise ships are designed.
Exactly. The physics are identical.
Because if an Austronesian ship hits a reef and tears a hole in the whole hull of ship fills with water and goes down. But with the Chinese bulkhead design, you divide the bottom of the ship into, say, 10 sealed watertight rooms. If you hit a reef and puncture the hull in room number 3, only room number 3 floods.
Right.
The other 9 rooms remain filled with air, retaining the ship's buoyancy, and the vessel limps back to port instead of sinking.
It was a revolutionary safety feature that allowed for massive scaling. Armed with fleets of these sturdy, colossal chuan ships, the Song dynasty completely altered the economic nature of the maritime Silk Road.
How so?
This era was no longer just about moving small quantities of high-value, luxury goods, like a tiny chest of frankincense or a single bag of nutmeg. This period marks the dawn of true merchant capitalism, characterized by the staggering mass production of export goods.
And when we talk about mass production in the Song dynasty, we are talking about ceramics, right? Chinaware.
The kilns of the Song dynasty became ancient industrial powerhouses. They were churning out tens of thousands of highly uniform ceramic bowls, plates, and vases specifically designed and glazed for the foreign export market.
Tens of thousands.
Yes. The Song government sent massive, state-sponsored trading fleets southward into a region they called the Nanhai, the South Seas. They were desperate to trade their ceramics for raw materials and exotic goods, particularly a highly coveted substance known as dragon's brain perfume.
Dragon's brain perfume. That sounds like a magical ingredient from a fantasy novel. What was it actually?
It was camphor.
Camphor.
Yeah. Camphor is a highly aromatic, crystalline substance derived from the wood and bark of a very specific rare tree found primarily in Sumatra and Borneo. It has a sharp, pungent, almost medicinal smell like modern vapor rub.
Oh, I know that smell.
It was incredibly difficult to extract, but it was phenomenally valued in Song China for use in medicine, high-end incense, and embalming rituals. The insatiable Chinese demand for camphor and rare spices transformed Chinese coastal cities, particularly Quanzhou and Guangzhou, into absolute megaports.
It was a total boom.
The volume of trade was so intense, and the maritime traffic between the Chinese ports and the Southeast Asian hubs became so dense that modern economic historians refer to this specific regional trading circuit as the Asian Mediterranean.
So for centuries, the Maritime Silk Road was actually dominated by Austronesians, Arabs, and Tamils, and China only started building deep-sea ships in the 10th century.
Basically, yes.
But even with this massive economic boom, the Song dynasty still couldn't completely break the Southeast Asian monopoly on the route, could they? Srivijaya was still sitting at the choke point.
That is correct, because even with their incredible watertight ships, the Chinese were still bound by the laws of thermodynamics. The Song dynasty enacted a strict legal limit. No Chinese trade ship could stay at sea for more than 9 months.
Why specifically 9 months?
It all comes back to the monsoons. The 9-month limit was a legal acknowledgement of the weather patterns. It meant a Chinese ship could safely sail south with the winter monsoon, conduct their business in the markets of Southeast Asia over a few months, and ride the summer monsoon straight back home.
But if they wanted to go further?
They couldn't. 9 months physically did not leave enough time to sail down to Indonesia, wait for the wind to shift, sail across the Indian Ocean to India or Arabia, wait for the wind to shift again, and make it all the way back to China.
Ah, I see.
As a result, the Chinese essentially never crossed the Indian Ocean during this period. They remained heavily reliant on the Southeast Asian thalassocracies to act as middlemen, buying Western goods from Srivijaya at a massive markup.
Srivijaya really had the perfect racket going. They taxed the Arabs and Indians coming from the west, and they marked up the prices for the Chinese coming from the north. But eventually, someone is going to get fed up with paying the toll.
And that frustration boiled over in truly spectacular violent fashion. By the 11th century, the Tamil Empire, located in southern India, had grown incredibly powerful. They possessed massive, wealthy merchant guilds that relied heavily on trade with China.
Okay, so the Tamils are feeling the squeeze.
Yes. Srivijaya, in an attempt to tighten their monopoly, began heavily regulating and taxing these Tamil trading guilds, restricting their access to the Strait of Malacca. In the year 1025, the Chola Emperor, Rajendra I, decided he had enough.
What did he do?
He launched a staggering surprise naval expedition straight across the ocean to attack Srivijaya.
Stop and think about the logistics of that for a second. A naval invasion across the Bay of Bengal in 1025 CE. You're talking about moving a fleet of hundreds of ships, carrying thousands of armed soldiers, elephants, and supplies across roughly 1,500 miles of open ocean.
With elephants.
Right. All timed perfectly to catch the monsoon winds so you hit the enemy before they know you were coming.
It was an unbelievable logistical and military achievement. And the invasion was a stunning, brutal success. The Chola fleet utilized the monsoon winds perfectly, striking multiple Srivijayan ports along the Strait of Malacca almost simultaneously.
Wow.
They sacked Palembang, the capital. They captured the Srivijayan king. While the Chola Empire didn't have the manpower to occupy Indonesia permanently, the invasion achieved its goal. It shattered Srivijaya's absolute monopoly and severely weakened the empire for over a century, allowing the Tamil merchant guilds to operate freely again.
So we have a booming medieval economy, industrial-scale mass production of ceramics, complex taxation structures, and transoceanic naval warfare over supply chain monopolies. It sounds incredibly, almost disturbingly modern.
History repeats itself.
But history is cyclical. Like any massive boom, the Asian Mediterranean was headed for a severe bust.
Which brings us to the 14th century, a period of severe compounding global disruptions. The political landscape of Asia was violently redrawn.
What happened in the 14th century?
China was invaded and completely conquered by the Mongols, who established the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols, traditionally a steppe culture, had a very different view of maritime trade. The Yuan government sought strict control, effectively monopolizing maritime shipping. They forced foreign Muslim merchants to partner directly with the state in highly regulated relationships known as ortas.
So the freewheeling, competitive merchant capitalism of the Song dynasty gets swallowed up by rigid state monopolies. That usually stifles innovation and trade volume.
It did. Furthermore, the Yuan dynasty attempted massive, wildly ambitious naval invasions of Japan, the Majapahit Empire in Java, and Vietnam.
Did they work?
No. Every single one of these invasions was a disastrous failure, draining immense resources and destroying countless ships. Meanwhile, nature itself turned against humanity. The 14th century saw a period of severe climate disruption. China was devastated by terrible floods, prolonged droughts, and resulting famines.
And the plague.
Yes. Simultaneously, the Black Death was sweeping through Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, decimating urban populations and utterly crippling consumer economies. All of these compounding catastrophes, war, famine, plague, and state monopolies, led to a massive, prolonged slump in trade along the Maritime Silk Road.
And down in the choke points of Southeast Asia, the political landscape is fracturing as well. Srivijaya is basically a ghost of its former self, eventually being absorbed by a new, aggressive Javanese empire called Majapahit.
Exactly. But the ghost of Srivijaya didn't want to stay dead. In the late 14th century, the old Srivijayan capital of Palembang attempted to rebel and break free from Majapahit's rule. They went so far as to send diplomatic envoys to the brand-new Ming dynasty in China, who had just successfully overthrown the Mongols, asking the Chinese emperor for protection and support.
I am guessing the Majapahit Empire did not take kindly to their vassal state trying to cut a side deal with the newly empowered Chinese emperor.
They reacted swiftly and violently. In 1377, Majapahit launched a brutal, punitive naval attack on Palembang. The city was devastated. This violent suppression triggered a diaspora of Palembang nobles and princes who fled the city for their lives.
Oh, wow.
One of those displaced nobles was a resilient man named Paramaswara. He essentially became a refugee prince, fleeing from island to island. He stayed in Singapore, modern-day Singapore, for a while before it too was attacked. Eventually, in the early 15th century, he fled up the western coast of the Malay Peninsula, found a quiet fishing village near a narrow point in the strait, and founded a new settlement.
And what did that become?
That settlement would rapidly grow into the incredibly wealthy and powerful Muslim Sultanate of Malacca.
So the Sultanate of Malacca literally rises from the ashes of Srivijaya, reclaiming the vital geographic choke point. And right around this exact same time, the early 15th century, the new Ming dynasty in China decides to flex its muscles on the global stage with perhaps the most famous and misunderstood naval expeditions in history, of voyages of Admiral Zheng He.
The voyages of Zheng He are legendary, but they require critical context. The Ming Emperor launched Zheng He's fleet, which was staggering in scale. We are talking about hundreds of colossal treasure ships, some estimated to be over 400 feet long, carrying up to 27,000 men.
27,000 men on a fleet of wooden ships.
The logistics of simply feeding 27,000 men at sea for months at a time is mind-boggling. But here's the crucial distinction. These were not exploratory missions like Columbus or Magellan, and they were not strictly commercial enterprises.
What were they for?
The goal was political projection. They sailed to Southeast Asia, India, and all the way to the coast of East Africa to force the so-called barbarian kings to acknowledge the absolute supremacy of the Ming Emperor and to resume sending tribute to the Chinese court.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the Sinocentric worldview. In this mindset, trade is not an exchange between equals. Trade is viewed as tribute. You bring exotic gifts to the emperor to acknowledge his superiority, and the emperor benevolently bestows gifts, often worth more than what you brought upon you in return. It's about hierarchy, not just profit.
Precisely. Zheng He's expeditions were visually spectacular, and they successfully restored diplomatic leverage and tribute relations with polities like the newly established Sultanate of Malacca. But this era of Chinese naval dominance was incredibly brief.
Right.
Funding a fleet of hundreds of massive ships carrying nearly 30,000 men was astronomically expensive, and it completely drained the imperial coffers. Simultaneously, the Ming dynasty faced severe, renewed military threats from the Mongols along their northern land borders. The Ming court advisors successfully argued that the treasure fleets were an extravagant, unnecessary waste of resources when the true threat was overland.
So they just stopped.
The Swansea emperor abruptly halted the voyages, dismantled the massive shipyards, and shortly after, the Ming government enacted the Haijin laws.
The Haijin, the Sedan laws.
Yes. In an extreme isolationist pivot, the Ming dynasty literally banned outgoing private maritime trade altogether. They burned ships. They ordered coastal populations to move inland. It was a massive withdrawal from the oceans.
So China wraps itself in a cocoon and turns its back on the sea. But the ocean abhors a vacuum because just over the horizon, the 16th century is arriving, and it is bringing a completely new, incredibly violent paradigm to the Maritime Silk Road.
The age of European exploration, and this era marks the terminal decline of the traditional indigenous maritime Silk Road.
When we talk about the European arrival, the Portuguese and the Spanish, I always visualize it as the ultimate hostile corporate buyout.
That's a good way to look at it.
For thousands of years, you had this complex, decentralized regional supply chain. Spices move from a local Indonesian island to Java. Java sells it to Malacca. Malacca sells it to a Tamil merchant. The Tamil sells it to an Arab dhow. The Arab dhow sells it to Egypt. And finally, Venetian merchants buy it in Alexandria and sell it to Europe. Everyone along the chain gets a cut.
Right, everyone wins a little.
But then the Europeans finally figure out how to sail around Africa.
And their entire economic strategy is based on absolute vertical integration. They don't want to participate in the regional chain. They want to violently cut out every single middleman between the Spice Islands and Europe.
So they just bypass everyone.
Or conquer them. In 1511, the Portuguese fleet arrives and violently captures the Sultanate of Malacca. By taking the choke point, they tear the heart right out of the traditional regional trade network. Meanwhile, the Spanish cross the Pacific Ocean, conquer the Philippines, and establish the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade.
We have to talk about the galleon trade because this is a monumental shift in global geography. We are no longer talking about regional coast-hugging hops across the Indian Ocean. The Manila galleon was the first permanent transoceanic trade route directly across the Pacific Ocean.
It was a brutal, incredibly lucrative circuit. The Spanish would purchase massive quantities of Chinese silk and porcelain from merchants who sailed down to Manila. They would load these goods into massive, heavily armed galleons.
And then what?
These ships then undertook a horrific 6-month continuous voyage across the brutal North Pacific to Acapulco in Mexico. The conditions on board were hellish. Scurvy and starvation routinely wiped out huge portions of the crew. But the profits justified the death toll. From Acapulco, the Asian goods were hauled overland to Veracruz, loaded onto the Spanish treasure fleets, and sailed across the Atlantic to Europe.
And how did Spain pay for all this Chinese silk? With massive, unprecedented quantities of silver mined by enslaved indigenous labor in the Americas, particularly from the mountain of Potosi.
Yes, so the traditional Indian Ocean Maritime Silk Road is essentially bypassed. Europe is using American silver to buy Asian goods directly, shipping them across the Pacific and Atlantic.
What happens to the Austronesians and the local Southeast Asian networks when they were cut out of the loop?
The tragic result is the rapid extinction of their indigenous maritime cultures and technologies. Because the demand for regional intermediary shipping completely collapsed under European monopolies, the massive Southeast Asian shipbuilding industry simply ceased to exist.
It just vanished.
Pretty much. By the late 17th century, the majestic Austronesian Jong ships, the massive, lashed-lug descendants of the original outriggers that had dominated the trade for millennia, were no longer being built. The technology, the generational knowledge of how to build them was simply lost to history.
That is so sad.
Only the Chinese chuan survived into modern times, largely because it continued to be used for essential coastal trade within China's domestic borders.
We have woven an incredible, sweeping narrative spanning thousands of years. But as the skeptical voice in the room, I have to ask, how do we actually know all this? The Austronesians didn't leave written records. The Chinese monks' journals could be exaggerated. If the wooden ships rotted away, isn't a lot of this just academic speculation? What is the hard physical evidence?
The undeniable evidence lies at the bottom of the ocean.
Shipwrecks.
Shipwrecks. Over the past few decades, our understanding of the Maritime Silk Road has been completely revolutionized by underwater marine archaeology. We are finding the physical shipwrecks, perfectly preserved in the anaerobic mud of the seafloor like sunken time capsules.
So what are they finding?
Well, marine archaeologists can meticulously differentiate the exact origins of these ships based precisely on the construction techniques we discussed earlier.
Walk me through a shipwreck. If you dive down and find a pile of rotting wood, how do you know who built it?
Let me give you concrete examples from the archaeological record. We have the Pontian boat, discovered in Malaysia, which dates way back to between 260 and 430 CE. We also have the famous Butuan ship burials excavated in the Philippines, containing multiple large boats dating from 689 to 988 CE.
And when they dug those up?
When marine archaeologists meticulously excavated the hulls of these wrecks, What did they find? They found the carved, protruding wooden lugs. They found the holes drilled for sewing the planks together. And crucially, when they subjected the wood to isotopic testing, they proved it was local Southeast Asian timber.
Proof!
Absolute physical proof of Austronesian shipbuilding dominance in the early period.
And what about the Arab presence? We talked about the dhows riding the monsoons. Do we have their ships?
We do, and the most famous is the Belaton shipwreck, discovered in shallow waters off the coast of Indonesia. It dates very precisely to around 826 CE.
826 CE.
Okay. When archaeologists analyzed the surviving hull timbers, they saw it was indeed a sewn plank ship. However, it completely lacked the carved internal lashed lugs used by the Austronesians. Furthermore, the stitching pattern was entirely different. The stitches were discontinuous, passing through the planks differently.
So it was an Arab ship.
This perfectly matches the distinct construction techniques of an Arab or Persian dhow from the Middle East. But here is the fascinating twist. While the ship was built like an Arab dhow, some of the timber used in the hull was identified as Southeast Asian species, while other parts were Indian.
So an Arab-designed ship built with Indian and Indonesian wood found sunken off the coast of Indonesia. That suggests these ships were constantly being repaired in foreign ports, or that the crews and shipwrights were entirely multinational.
Exactly. It proves the cosmopolitan reality of the network.
And what about the Chinese ships?
They don't appear in the archaeological record of the deep Southeast Asian seas until much later, which perfectly corroborates the historical texts regarding their delayed entry into deep ocean sailing.
Right, because they were stuck in the rivers early on.
Exactly. The earliest known Chinese shipwrecks found along the southern route are the Truyang wreck, dating between 1305 and 1370 CE, and the Bacao wreck from the early 15th century. And we know undeniably they are Chinese because the hulls are completely flat, there is structural evidence of a heavy central rudder, and the planks are fastened together with rusting iron nails, not flexible fiber lashings.
So the skeletal remains of the ships themselves tell the story of who was sailing when. But let's talk about the cargo. We mentioned earlier that the Song dynasty was mass-producing ceramics. I've heard archaeologists describe ceramics as the plastic of the ancient world.
That is a highly accurate analogy. Much like modern plastics, high-fired ceramics are practically indestructible. They don't rot away in the salt water like silk or spices do, and they don't rust into nothingness like iron weapons.
They just sit there.
Right. Furthermore, because the imperial Chinese kilns frequently changed their specific artistic designs, glazed chemistries, and official kiln stamps based on the reigning emperor, archaeologists can date a piece of pottery found in a shipwreck or buried city with incredible precision, sometimes down to a specific decade.
That is incredibly useful.
Therefore, we use the spread of Chinese ceramics to accurately map the buying power and locate the major trade hubs of the ancient world.
And when you map out thousands of ceramic shards across the ocean, where is the highest concentration?
The absolute largest concentrations of Chinese export ceramics are found directly along the Strait of Malacca and the northern coast of the island of Java.
The choke points.
Yes. This physically undeniably proves that this specific Indonesian region was the beating heart of the entire network, the primary node of wealth and exchange where East met West.
Well, that makes total sense.
But we must also remember that ceramics, while survivable, were just one part of the trade. If we look at the western leg of the route, spanning from East Africa to India and the Middle East, one of the most voluminous and valuable cargoes wasn't silk or pots, it was ivory.
Ivory from Africa.
Yes. The source texts note that the western half of the network could accurately be renamed the Maritime Ivory Route, given the staggering continuous volume of African elephant ivory moving across the ocean to feed the carving markets in India and China.
So what does this all mean? We have uncovered this incredibly rich, complex history of multinational cooperation, ingenious technological innovation, and profound cultural exchange stretching back thousands of years. But from my understanding of modern geopolitics, the history of the Maritime Silk Road isn't just staying neatly in the past. This ancient history is actively being deployed right now.
That is a crucial observation. It brings us directly to the modern politicization of ancient oceans. History is a powerful form of leverage, and the narrative of the Maritime Silk Road is currently being weaponized and selectively mythologized by modern nation-states to justify current geopolitical ambitions.
Let's lay this out analytically and impartially, focusing on how the history is utilized today based on the provided material. How exactly is a 2,000-year-old trade route affecting modern policy?
Well, the source text highlights China as a prominent example. In 2013, the Chinese government proposed the massive Belt and Road Initiative, which specifically includes a heavily funded pillar called the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road.
Okay, an infrastructure project.
Right. And to historically justify this monumental infrastructure investment and strategic expansion into Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and Africa, Chinese state narratives frequently utilize a highly selective, mythologized image of the ancient realm.
How so?
The material notes, they widely promote the idea that it was primarily a Chinese-led endeavor, emphasizing the brief voyages of Zheng He, and erroneously projecting Chinese state power and maritime dominance backward across 2 millennia. This largely ignores the foundational reality that Austronesians, Arabs, and Tamils built to maintain the network for centuries before Chinese ships ever entered the deep ocean.
It's a way of using history to say, we aren't expanding into new territory, we are simply returning to our historical norm. This obviously has massive implications when you consider ongoing modern disputes, like the territorial claims in the South China Sea and international debates surrounding maritime law. But China isn't the only nation utilizing this tactic, are they?
Not at all. The source texts point out that India is actively engaged in very similar historical mythologization to counter Chinese influence. In 2014, the Indian government launched Project Masan, a strategic initiative that similarly aims to politically and economically reconnect old cultural trade links across the Indian Ocean.
And how do they frame the history?
In doing so, Indian nationalist narratives often rely heavily on outdated historical theories, pioneered in the 1920s by early historians, that portray India's ancient interactions with Southeast Asia as a form of Greater India. They describe the spread of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sanskrit as a one-way process of cultural diffusion, essentially framing ancient Southeast Asia as a passive recipient of ancient Indian cultural colonization.
But based on everything we just discussed, the mung beans being sent back to India, the Austronesian outrigger technology being adopted by Indian fishermen, the shared jade networks, we know the archaeological evidence proves the exchange was deeply reciprocal. It wasn't one-way colonization from a superior center. It was a complex, mutual exchange driven just as much by local Southeast Asian agency and initiative as it was by Indian merchants.
Exactly. As modern historians have repeatedly noted in the material, those old theories of one-way cultural colonization have been entirely discredited by the archaeological reality. This raises an important question, though. Looking at this ancient history strictly through the lens of modern nation-states, framing it as a competition between China and India, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the network.
It was entirely stateless, it was fluid, it was a decentralized multinational web built largely by the Austronesians, a group of people who do not belong to any single modern geopolitical superpower today.
Precisely. It was a shared human achievement, driven by individual merchants, sailors, and indigenous innovators, not a nationalist talking point to be claimed by a modern government.
And that brings us directly to why this history matters to you, the listener, right now. We constantly talk about globalization as if it is a purely modern phenomenon. We act like the world only became interconnected with the invention of the internet, or maybe the standardization of the steel shipping container in the 1950s. But the true, unvarnished history of the Maritime Silk Road proves that humanity has been globally connected for thousands of years.
That is the big takeaway here.
We have been actively sharing complex ideas, borrowing life-saving technologies, and trading bananas and jade across thousands of miles of violent open ocean since before the Great Pyramid of Giza was even considered ancient history.
It undeniably demonstrates that the human drive to connect, to explore the unknown, and to exchange value is deeply intrinsically ingrained in our species. The terrifying expanse of the ocean was never a permanent barrier to our ancestors. Through sheer ingenuity, they transformed it into a highway.
A highway built entirely without concrete, without an emperor's decree, and without a rigid master plan. Which leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Think back to our opening metaphor about how we visualize history. We tend to look for human achievement only in the places that are obvious and easy to see. We look for massive stone pyramids rising out of the desert. We look for great walled cities. We look for stone tablets covered in the boastful decrees of long-dead kings.
Right, the monuments.
But the absolute greatest maritime network in human history wasn't built by cultures that left behind towering stone monuments to their own egos. They left a profound legacy in the microscopic mitochondrial DNA of chickens wandering around Madagascar. They left it in the flexible, lashed lug design of fishing boats still bravely navigating the reefs in the Philippines today. They left it in the linguistic roots of the words for the foods we eat every single day. So if we completely missed the existence of the largest, most dynamic trade network in human history for centuries simply because we were only looking for stone monuments and silk, simply because we were looking for the wrong kind of evidence. What other world-changing human achievements have we completely overlooked simply because we are looking in the wrong places? Keep looking deeper. We will see you on the next deep dive.